Joining us on the line now is Ambassador John Bolton, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Good to have you with us. How are you this morning, Ambassador Bolton?
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me again.
All right, listen, I read something that you said the other day. You said that you were sort of just shocked, stunned, and a little bit outraged at what the president said. And the president is talking in an interview that he gave, apparently, and somehow got picked up in the New York Times, that of what he would have done if he had been ISIS. And you were quite surprised by this and a little bit irritated.
Well, it was a meeting the president had to believe was going to be reported broadly, and he was sort of speculating that if he had been ISIS, of course, he's smarter than everybody in the world anyway, but if he had been ISIS, he wouldn't have beheaded the Americans. He would have pinned notes on their shirts and sent them out saying, stay away, it's none of your business, and that would have undercut support in America for military intervention. Well, say, that's an interesting perspective for the American commander-in-chief. Very hard to understand what the president could be thinking of, except I think that's his deepest belief, is that he doesn't really have his heart in military intervention.
Well, that's what I was going to get to, because it seems to me that when you listen to the president, his body language, the word that he chooses, the reluctance to use the word that we're at war, everything that he's doing seems to be suggesting that he is going into this kicking and screaming, and he really doesn't want to go after ISIS.
Well, I think that is the signal he's sending. I think that's why the Allied response, both in Europe and among the Arabs, has been so weak, because they don't believe the president's committed, and they've seen this kind of reticence on the part of the Obama administration before in Syria, in Ukraine, I mean, you name it. And that's why, particularly in the Middle East, the Arab states are hedging their bets. ISIS is a clear threat to them, but they want to know what the United States is really prepared to do. Otherwise, they will, in typical Middle Eastern fashion, cut a deal. They won't like that, but it's better than risking military conflict and then watching the Obama administration drift away at a critical point.
Ambassador Bolton, it was Secretary of State John Kerry's responsibility last week to go through the Middle East and rally support from those Arab nations. The president said that those would be the boots on the ground, those Arab nations who had a vested interest in stemming the ISIS tide. What is your assessment of John Kerry's efforts now that we see it looks like a few of the countries jumping on board with some support?
Well, that's what they said yesterday, but it's very interesting. On the front page of the Wall Street Journal this morning, it says U.S. efforts to build a broad coalition to combat the Islamic State ran straight into the sectarian chasm that has divided the Middle East for centuries. I guess the State Department missed that when they announced all these countries coming on board. I mean, the fact is, there's been rhetoric, but very little palpable military commitment. Now, again, it's early days, but the returns, the initial returns, are not good, that's for sure.
So it looks as though some of the major ground forces, other than the Iraqi military, will be the Syrian Army. And it seems to me, if we are providing all of the airstrikes, and the Syrian Army then is going through and working the ground there to get rid of ISIS, we're basically Assad's Air Force, are we not?
Well, I don't think they contemplate the Syrian army so much as the Syrian opposition. But let's face it, we still don't know how dependable they are. The Iraqi army, for goodness sakes, is hardly dependable. It was their collapse near Mosul about a month ago that led to this dramatic expansion of ISIS or ISIL. The Kurdish forces, the Peshmerga, are better, but they need equipment. And this, I think, is what's fundamentally wrong with the president saying no American combat forces on the ground.
Well, yeah.
If you believe ISIS is a threat to the United States, the president says it is, if you believe that ISIS must be destroyed, and the president says it is, are we really going to base American safety, the safety of our people here at home, on the performance of the Iraqi army? Or are we going to do what we need to do to protect ourselves? There are plenty of others who need to join with us. They need to play a major role. But American safety depends on America before it depends on anybody else.
Well, this is the theme of your most current column, where you talk about the fact that if you really want to solve the problem with ISIS, it's going to require boots on the ground.
I think we need honesty from our leaders, and we're not getting it from the White House. They're still trying to figure out what their strategy is. because it's campaign season, Republicans and Democrats alike are fleeing from this, as the saying in the South goes, like scalded dogs, and we're not getting a coherent debate. The argument that I think the president is trying to make is we'll go with the Iraqi army and the Kurds, and we'll see how well they do, and if they don't do well enough, we'll consider something else. But that simply gives ISIS a chance to consolidate its hold over the territory that it now controls, a territory, by the way, the size of Great Britain.
Yeah.
So every day that goes by allows them to strengthen their position, and I think, unfortunately, risks raising the cost in American life if we eventually do have to go in. The way to do this now, with proper planning, of course, is to strike with overwhelming force right now before ISIS can consolidate its hold.
Our guest is Ambassador John Bolton. We're talking about the various strategies that could work against ISIS. You just said overwhelming force. Yesterday we had Lieutenant Colonel Tony Schaefer on. He was part of the Special Operations Forces that went into Afghanistan immediately following the events of 9/11. He says special ops with about 30 days could take care of ISIS. I guess the question then is to you is what then? What next? After you get rid of ISIS, we need to have, or someone needs to have, a permanent place there in Iraq until they get their act together, don't they?
Well, I think the government of Iraq is functionally gone. I think putting it back together again is very unlikely to succeed. My proposal is acknowledge that the Kurds are independent. They've got their own state de facto. We should recognize it. And if we can defeat ISIS, I would create an Arab state out of the territory of western Iraq and eastern Syria. I'd confine Assad to his little Alawite enclave, and I'd acknowledge that both he and the Baghdad government are tools of Iran. The real issue after ISIS is Iran and its support for terrorism, its nuclear weapons program. But the way we're dealing with ISIS under the president's plan almost guarantees failure. It is a plan of gradual escalation. Remember that phrase? That worked so well in Vietnam, didn't it? I mean, I think if
Right.
we've learned anything, it's if America is in conflict, it needs to act with all the resources it has, because that minimizes the toll in American lives if we act with overwhelming force rather than if we drag it out over a long period of time.
Very quickly, have you heard these stories about what was going on in the basement of Foggy Bottom? I mean, you know your way around the State Department. Basement operation where they were scrubbing documents related to Benghazi. The Secretary of State's Chief of Staff was there overseeing the operation. What do you think about all that?
I'm stunned by this. I mean, obviously it's one person's statement at this point. We need to find out more about it. But I think the most significant thing in this story was the presence of Cheryl Mills down in that basement room looking over those documents. If Hillary Clinton had nothing to worry about, there was absolutely no reason for her chief of staff to be worrying about documents, because obviously they wouldn't contain any problem for the Secretary of State. If it's accurate that Hillary's chief of staff was down there, if it's accurate they were separating out problematic documents, this is a nuclear weapon, I think, in the heart of her presidential campaign.
All right, Ambassador Bolton, thank you so much. Appreciate you joining us this